the series on bourgeois revolutions. Brian Manning is probably best known as the author of The English People and the English Revolution, but just to describe very briefly his background, his qualifications for speaking to us today, he was associated in the 1950s with the Communist History Group and was a founder of Past and Present, the review of the Communist History Group, and also at one time shared a flat with Eric Hobsbawm. He will not be answering questions on whether or not Eric Hobsbawm did his share of the washing up. Professor Manning is currently Professor of History at the University of Ulster in Coleraine and is working on a successor volume, The Radicals and the English Revolution. And he's going to be speaking today about current revisionist interpretations of the English Revolution from right-wing historians and why the English Revolution is still important for Marxists today.
Thanks so much. Well, I hadn't expected to become famous for sharing a flat with Eric Hobsbawm. I think I should point out that I did live in the servants' quarters of that flat. Ever since the last shot was fired in the English Civil War, the causes and consequences of those events have been debated, often in very fierce controversy, from generation to generation. That in itself, I think, is a recognition of the significance and importance of those events. The English Revolution has remained a living fact from generation to generation, and how it is interpreted continues to be a matter of importance in our own times. It is, after all, about the role of revolution, the role of class struggle, the role of popular movements in history. The existence of a so-called revisionist interpretation of the English Revolution implies that there is or was an orthodox interpretation. I think there have been three broad interpretations of the English Revolution that each, in their own time, have commanded sufficient support to be described as orthodoxies. First of all, there has been the political interpretation, which was best expressed in the form of the Whig interpretation, and that is that it was a struggle for political freedom against growing monarchical absolutism and resulted in the establishment of constitutional monarchy and parliamentary government. Secondly, there has been the religious interpretation that it was a religious conflict between different tendencies within the Church of England. At that time, everybody was required to belong to one church, the Church of England. Those tendencies may be characterized in different ways. They may be characterized as more Catholic tendencies on the one hand and more Protestant on the other, or as high and low and so forth. And that the revolution resulted in the breakup of the national church and a permanent division between, on the one hand, an established Anglican church and, on the other hand, Protestant dissent and nonconformity. A struggle that in many ways still continues to this day in the north of Ireland. It was also, up to a point, a struggle for religious toleration. And the third broad interpretation has been that it was an economic conflict between an older feudal economic order and rising capitalist enterprises in agriculture and manufacture, and resulted in a decisive shift towards a capitalist economy and away from a pre-industrial economy towards an industrial one, a watershed in the history of the transition from feudalism to capitalism. Now, having said those things, one finds that one has there listed the great themes of British history. The struggle against monarchical power, the struggle for constitutional parliamentary government, the struggle for the right of representation, the right to vote, the struggle for religious toleration and religious liberty, the transition from a feudal to a capitalist economy. So that the debate about the English Revolution has and remains a debate about the whole course of the history of England. Now, the issue about the English Revolution is this. Nobody can deny that none of those things that I've mentioned had any part in the English Revolution. The people in the English Revolution debated the respective powers of king and parliament. They debated issues of the franchise and representation. They debated issues of religion and religious toleration. They debated questions about the economy and the general direction in which the economy should or should not develop. The question then is not that those things played no part in the English Revolution. The only question can be is how great a part those issues played in the English Revolution. Faced with the endless controversies about the English Revolution, often conducted in a polemical spirit, the safest course has often seemed to be to take no general view of the revolution at all. The editor of a recent volume of essays boasts in the introduction that no particular view of the period prevails in these pages. Research historians concentrate upon minute and detailed work on particular aspects. And as one of the contributors remarks in that same volume, we now have many fine studies of individual trees, but are in danger of losing our appreciation of the wood in which they are situated. Faced with controversies over the general interpretation of the English Revolution, students and teachers often find themselves reduced to summarizing the views of the various contestants and leaving the fundamental problems of what the revolution was really all about unstated and unresolved. At the same time, there is a hankering for a consensus and to find some things on which it can be said that all the debaters agree. Jim Sharp says, amidst the fog of controversy, and the phrase is well chosen, amidst the fog of controversy which shrouds the origins, progress and significance of events in England between 1640 and 1660, two themes, it seems safe to claim, are universally recognized as being of central importance. That religion was one of the first things being contested for, and that a grasp of contemporary local tensions and local preoccupations is a vital aid to understanding what happened in the two troubled decades in question. Note the caution of the statements. Religion was one of the first things being contested for. Did it change? Does it mean that that was the primary thing? But in any case, it doesn't commit one to very much. And a grasp of local issues is an aid doesn't actually say it was all about local issues, but an aid to understanding. And Christopher Hill, reviewing the so-called revisionist contribution to the study of the revolution, claims to see an emerging consensus that the most important things were not happening at the court in Whitehall or in the Parliament at Westminster, but in the villages and local communities, where the divide between the poor and the better off was becoming sharper, and where some farmers, artisans, small traders were prospering from economic changes and forming local elites, increasingly dominating the economy, religion, and politics of their neighborhoods, and often adopting Puritanism as the approach most in harmony with their aspirations. Revisionism in terms of parliamentary history may have served a useful purpose in redressing the balance. It has rightly pointed out that the importance of the House of Commons has been exaggerated and the influence of the House of Lords underestimated, and similarly that the importance of the gentry has been overplayed as against the continuing power of the peers. It has rightly stressed the importance of the localities and local issues as against conceptions of the nation and national issues. But where it goes wrong is in its main intention, which is to destroy the conception of an English revolution at all. Ideally, the revisionists would like to eliminate the English Revolution from the history books. They do this sometimes by denying that there was a revolution at all and show a preference for terms like revolt, rebellion, civil war, interregnum. They deny it by saying that it was an accident, it was a series of chance events, and they deny it by saying that it had no significance at all in the course of English history. But unfortunately, the events, the issues, the people are still there and cannot simply be obliterated. The notion that the early Stuart kings were aiming at absolute monarchy and that there was an opposition in Parliament seeking to limit the powers of the monarch and increase the powers of the House of Commons, or the two houses of Parliament. This notion has to be demolished by the revisionist because traditionally it has been part of the conception of an English revolution. Yet some members of Parliament undoubtedly did see themselves as defending a traditional constitution which Charles I, by his actions, was undermining. And if the government of Charles I had not collapsed in face of the Scottish invasion, and again it's perhaps characteristic of the traditional view that we confine discussion of events to England, ignoring what was happening in Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, each of which was having its own revolution at the time. In face of the Scottish invasion in 1640, the drift towards absolute monarchy in England on the continental model would have continued. The constitutional issue remains there and cannot be wished away. The fact that the English Revolution saw the overthrow of Charles I, the execution of the king, and the abolition of the monarchy cannot be ignored in the whole history of English constitutional parliamentary government. The notion that social tensions and conflicts brought about the Civil War has also to be eliminated by the revisionists. At one time, this was done by saying that the conflict was within the ruling class and denying any role to popular forces outside that class. But what was the ruling class fighting with itself about? About politics, or about religion, or about economics? Every time an issue is identified which seems to divide the parties, it is then blurred, and we are then told that both sides seem remarkably similar, composed of the same sort of people with the same sort of ideas. And yet they were willing to fight and die for something. What was it? If not for the Constitution, then was it for religion? Or was it economic? A rising gentry against a declining gentry. Landowners who were adopting capitalist methods of production and policies against landowners still embedded in the old feudal economy. But that is dangerous, because once that is said, it reintroduces a notion of class conflict, and it introduces a notion that the English Revolution is significant in the transition from feudalism to capitalism. So far safer to avoid economic divisions and stick to religion as the true cause of the war. The advantage here is that the religious issues were undoubtedly real and profound. Nobody would deny that, affecting men's outlook on politics, economics, and indeed on the world as a whole. And religious issues did cut across social and class divisions, dividing people of the same class and uniting people of different classes. But if we continue to say that the English Revolution was a religious conflict, then the notion of a revolution still remains. It remains intact in the form, the classic form, that S.R. Gardner, the great Victorian historian, propounded, the so-called Puritan Revolution. That Puritan Revolution, which has been explored and developed in ever greater depth and sophistication by Christopher Hill, and in his work, the social tensions and the conflicts within the society have surfaced again. Rather than for the revisionist to continue to challenge the definition, meaning and significance of Puritanism, and to attempt to show that there were Puritans on both sides, it then perhaps comes safer to get away from religion altogether, and to say that there were in fact no national conflicts, but a series of local conflicts over purely local issues fought by local groups. But as soon as historians begin to analyze in any depth those local conflicts, religion, politics, and economics creep back again. And there is a logical and factual impossibility about regarding the Civil War as just a series of local conflicts. People in the localities were reacting to events, declarations, policies emanating from the centre, from the king or from the parliament. And they were intent upon influencing events, declarations, and policies at the centre. Yet it is undoubtedly true that the localities were of crucial importance. And as Sharp said, a grasp of contemporary local tensions and local preoccupations is vital to understanding what happened in the two troubled decades. The issues were not only seen differently, but were different in various localities. But what has emerged from the local studies is not the demolition of a class interpretation of the 17th century, but the discovery that classes were organized on a local basis and that class conflict took place in a local context between a ruling class of aristocrats, large landowners and great merchants, a middle class of rising farmers, artisans and small traders, and a lower class consisting of the mass of the labouring poor. This is not an invention of historians with hindsight, but how people at the time saw their society and its conflicts. And that's why I have adopted terms like the aristocracy, the middle sort of people, and the poorer sort of people. Those were the terms in which people saw their own society in the 17th century. The middle sort of people of the English Revolution, like the bourgeoisie at all times, fought on two fronts. And that explains their failure or unwillingness to carry the revolution through to complete success. Allying with the poor in order to defeat the rich and the aristocracy, they then later compromised with the rich in order to defeat the poor. This interpretation is challenged by the revisionists on the grounds that most people were neutral in the Civil War and that the largest popular movement took the form of resistance to the war itself and to the demands of the parties. That is true. They also argue that when the middle sort of people took an active part, they were as likely to support the king as to support the parliament. And that when the masses were activated to any degree, they were more likely to exhibit conservatism than radicalism. It is true that only small sections of the middle sort and of the masses supported Parliament. And it is true that radicals were a very small minority. And it is true that the radical revolution in the 1650s failed because it lacked sufficient popular support. Understanding of the revolution must encompass and be able to explain the neutrality of most of the people and the conservatism of the masses. The influence of the church, its age-old teaching of obedience to one's superiors, the traditional deference, preoccupation with day-to-day struggle for survival in face of acute economic hardships, were factors. But one thing is clear: the people were not mere ciphers manipulated at the will of their masters, as the revisionists like to represent them. And in the neutralist peace movement, the risings of the clubmen was a contemporary term for peasant. The club was the traditional weapon of the peasant. In the risings of the clubmen, masses of the people refused to fight for either king or parliament and tried to force the two sides to make peace. But they appeared under banners that were inscribed, "For ourselves." Their ideas may have been conservative in the sense of wishing to return to the situation before the Civil War and to normality. because after all, patently, life was worse now than it had been previously. But they recognized that the people were the victims, and that the people could only change things by acting for themselves. That is what the risings of the clubmen were. Taking the law into their own hands, forming their own organizations, associations they called them, forming their own peace army, levying their own taxes, and in effect forming in the localities their own alternative government. Their ideas may have been conservative or reactionary, but their methods and ethos were not. Had they succeeded, Parliament would not have won the Civil War. In the short run, the clubmen were not wrong. The benefits of Parliament's victory in the Civil War went to the middle sort of people. And it does not matter that only some of the middle sort of people supported Parliament. What matters is that their support was crucial in the success of Parliament and crucial in the outcome of the English Revolution, in carrying it much further than the leaders of Parliament intended, in bringing about the overthrow of the monarchy, the House of Lords, the establishment of a republic, and the partial and temporary displacement of the ruling class. Religious, political, and economic issues did divide members of the nobility and gentry in a variety of ways. But they all feared revolution. And what in fact divided them in the end into two parties was their reactions to that fear. For the Royalist Party, the way to prevent revolution was to defend the traditional institutions of church and state. And for the Parliamentarian Party, the way to escape revolution was to reform the institutions of church and state before they could be overthrown by a revolt from below. Now, that interpretation is a matter of judgment. It would be challenged by the revisionists. What I would maintain is that the evidence is overwhelming of the fears felt and expressed by the ruling class, whether royalist or parliamentarians, of a social revolution taking place. I would maintain it is supported by the facts and by the evidence. The struggle then between these two ways of defending the existing social order, and that is what they were seeking to do, tipped over into revolution because a divided ruling class partially lost control of the situation. In the localities, Puritan yeoman artisans and traders took over for a time, and again, that is a point at which the interpretation might be challenged, and again I would say that the evidence and the facts are now so strong that indeed such groups did take power locally over large stretches of the country. And that was long enough to wrench England into new directions towards a capitalist economy and society. That involved the breaking down of restraints on capitalist enterprise, accumulating farms into larger units, producing for the market by means of the employment of wage labour, producing enough food so that England ceased to be subject to periodic famines, and instead of being an importer of food, became an exporter of food, increasing purchasing power of large sections of the population, and so stimulating the production of cheap goods for mass consumption, production increasingly carried out by artisans who employed larger amounts of wage labour and became capitalist employers, and finally disciplining the masses to wage labour. The precondition of all those developments was the crushing in the 1650s of the most radical popular movements in the revolution. Those movements which sought security for small producers, peasants and artisans. There took place in the 1640s and 1650s the crushing of the last peasant and artisan revolts in English history. There took place the crushing of the last efforts by the peasants and artisans to prevent the development of a capitalist economy and against themselves being reduced to wage labours. In that sense, the English Revolution then was decisive. It was decisive for the mass of peasants and artisans in England, and it was decisive for the development of English society and economy.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm sure Mr. Brown's talks, there's plenty of time for questions and contributions, so can I see indications from people who'd like to speak, please? Yeah.
I'd like to ask a question about the role of the radicals in the Civil War, because there is a great deal of romantic, but I think very real political admiration for some of the gestures, some of the politics of the levellers and the diggers in particular. So perhaps you could expand more on that particular aspect of the revolution, the contribution in terms of the battle of ideas that people like Winstanley made to that period and subsequent events.
Yeah. Oh, I take them as the...
well, do you want to...
Yeah, right, no, fine, right, okay.
Yeah, thanks. To follow on from the last speaker, if you could say a little bit more about the diggers and, say a little bit more. I mean, as far as I can see, that is a local issue. I mean, I'm not an expert on the Civil War or anything, but from my understanding of it, they were inspired by actual local issues initially. You could say a little bit more about them. And also, you mentioned during your talk that there were other revolutions going on in, say, Scotland, Ireland. You mentioned that. If you could say a little bit about if that had any impact at all, how did that affect people? I mean, I know that during the late 1400s there was, disruption with people refusing to pay taxes. It wasn't like an action of solidarity, it was just that they were pissed off about paying taxes to fight the war in Scotland, basically. But if you could perhaps, comment on if that had any effect and how that manifested itself. And also, I didn't quite understand what you were saying at the end about you said something about yeomen had taken over the sort of, not means of production, but taken over their sort of farms, their businesses, whatever, and that this somehow led to capitalism. Could you perhaps expand on that from people like myself who are a bit confused about all of understand things? Right.
Yeah.
Similarly, a question about Ireland in particular, and what extent was like shipping the new model army out to Ireland, sort of undermining any sort of after Clapham or wherever it was, but shipping the army out there, undermining any sort of resurgence of radical ideas, or was it just getting rid of a group of armed men?
Yeah, come on in the front.
Yeah, it seems that
one of the major arguments the revisionist puts forward is to kind of see the Civil War in isolation, as if 1640, 1660 was a kind of accident of history, and that whatever happened before or after was of no relevance. Now, I'd like to know is, can you see in, say, anti-enclosure riots and riots in London before 1640, some sort of sense in which there's some kind of continuity, and equally, after 1660, where did the radicals go from there, from this experience of defeat? In what ways did the experience of the 1640s and 1650s change their attitudes? Did they? Can you see the sort of defeat of radicalism in the Civil War as kind of paving the way towards new forms of organization and new forms of struggle?
I want to say something about how for the revisionism, the idea there wasn't an English Revolution or that it hadn't been rather capital, how its influence makes things difficult for Marxists who are trying to explain things, because most of us operate on a fairly narrow reading of English history. We've read Christopher Hill, we've read what Marx had to say about the English Revolution, some of us have read what Trotsky had to say in his writing on Britain about the English Revolution. We have a picture of the English Revolution as being the first major bourgeois revolution. And yet we have all this stuff thrown at us. If you read, I don't read detailed history things, but you read reviews and various publications, and you get the feeling, Christ, perhaps we've been brought up on all these misleading facts, this dogmatism from Marx and so on and so forth, which doesn't fit into the picture. We find fantastic on the defensive when it comes to confronting it. At the same time, when you read the most recent Marxist work on the rise of capitalism, I'm thinking of the stuff by Bob Brenner, it really just concentrates on the countryside. It doesn't talk at all about the political events, the revolutions, and so on and so forth. I wonder if Brian would try and bring together how we see the things come together and how we answer these questions.
Can we go to there?
You seem to be saying at the end of your talk that whatever were the causes of the revolution, that in a sense it laid the political and to a large extent the ideological basis for that flowering, that rise of the bourgeois class that was to really sort of find its place in 19th century England. There seems, though, in terms of the material basis for that class, in other words, the sort of primitive accumulation of capital that laid the material basis for the development of that class, to be quite a long gap between the actual revolution, between that ideological and that political basis and the actual material basis. Is there anything that explains the length of that gap?
Next.
Yeah, it's a point really about historiography, perhaps more than centrally about the Civil War, but I think it fits in because really in the late 40s and the 50s, as I understand it, one of the things that the Communist Party Historians Group tried to do was to sort of construct the people's history based on the popular struggles of things like the Civil War, the Chartists and so on. Now, whatever we might think about perhaps the dubious nature of that project, I think there was some degree of success, certainly when I was at school. I remember when I did O-level history, the basic textbook in use was Christopher Hill, so clearly, there was some degree of resonance there. Now, what I'm interested in is you've chosen to talk about the Civil War in the context of the challenge of revisionist arguments nowadays. Now, really, are you trying to say that that project of popular history and the idea of sort of popular struggle around Civil War and so on is now really redundant, and that the big problem facing Marxists now is how to deal with the new revisionism? Obviously revisionism has always been there, but is it really the case now that revisionism has gained a new strength, and that any idea of sort of class struggle or popular history is very much on the defensive?
What if you could say something about the balance of class forces and the circumstances at the end of this period that enabled the achievements of the revolution to survive, obviously, what was a political counter-revolution and the restoration of the monarchy? How the two things balanced out so that the restoration of the monarchy didn't represent a complete abandonment of every successful revolution, how these two things coexisted?
Yeah. There's about 10 minutes left of our time if anyone else would like to ask a question or make a contribution.
Actually, like pro-revolutionary, we kind of we don't look at something in the Pacific, we always look back in the past, and indeed the English Revolution is a bit far back. We always look back, and for us as revolutionists, we say, well, the starting point of the actual revolution was in the 16th century with the actual scientific revolution, where the founding of the bourgeoisie, the new bourgeoisie, the capitalist bourgeoisie of the whole idea of science, and arguing against the whole idea of the God ruling and the royalty and so on, ruling parliament and so on, ruling the people and so on. The whole argument of liberalisation of human beings themselves, the whole enlightenment era of human beings themselves actually controlling the country and so on. And there's nothing. I don't understand really how, if the actual bourgeoisie was so confident in the revolution, how come it actually went back to to Cromwell and so on? How come they actually put all the power in Cromwell's hands and the actual army itself?
Yes, a few contributions ago, a comrade said that the revisionists see the Civil War in isolation. That is the crux as I see it. The argument history is Marxist, a process rather than a series of historical accidents and so on. I think we've got to look at, in terms of the development of class forces between capitalism and feudalism, we've got to look at the development of how money and capital controlled the way the economy worked and how the economy landed. As you go through the latter half of the previous century, before the Civil War, and the 42 years after the Civil War, in that century, you've got the massive development of trade, exports of wool and so on, massive development of capital, which obviously creates a lot of power for the people, for the merchants and so on, that hold that power. As that development reached a point where the capitalists were beginning to suffer from the restraints that the ruling class were putting on them, they had to think about taking over political control and trying to get rid of those restrictive laws. That was, in a sense, why the lords and so on, the feudalists at the time, who did have vast amounts of interest in capital, started to think about conflict with the king, which eventually led to the Civil War. But again, you've got to look, after the reason why the capitalists weren't really serious about taking it right to its logical conclusion is it conceded ground to people like the levellers and the diggers in the New Model Army, who Cromwell eventually had to crush. He actually, rounded a lot of them and shot them, as simple as that. That's about all I've got to say.
Right, if there's no one else who wants to ask a question, yeah, okay. Last call, and then I'll ask Brian to sum up.
I'd like to know if it was possible for the levellers to win, and if they had won, what sort of society would they set up? What would have been possible? The only other one was why did they bring back the monarchy?
I mean, just in part to answer that last contribution, it's been 8 or 9 years since I did this at school. I haven't had anything since, but basically, Marxists look at the material things at the time and the material production. I mean, the rise of bourgeoisie at that time was inevitable. There's no way that the ideas of John Rees, Stanley, the diggers and the leftlers could have any success, because the material conditions were not there for the sort of communist society that they wanted. The material conditions were there for the rise of capitalism, yes. So I seem to remember that forgive me if facts are wrong, but the Civil War, what started was, that they wanted to go up and conquer Ireland, but the parliamentarians didn't trust the king and the king didn't trust the parliamentarians, so both raised an army each, and they ended up fighting each other. But I mean, at the end of all that, the New Model Army did go to conquer Ireland. I mean, what would have happened if the leftists did have some sort of influence in the New Model Army? And actually won out for a time. I mean, maybe they wouldn't have conquered down so quickly, but that conquest is inevitable, and the rise of bourgeoisie is inevitable, so there's no way that some sort of anarchists, I think, go around saying that if only Gerald Winstanley had won out, if only the leftists and the New Model Army had won out, then we would have had a wonderful communist society and we could have escaped all this capitalist nonsense. So that's absolutely crap. And that's why Lenin said, basically, what a wonderful man Oliver Cromwell was. I mean, the point is, I mean, you say to any Irish Republican what a wonderful man Oliver Cromwell was, you know, you're going to end up getting chased on the street with, you know, with the carbon off yourself. I mean, obviously, there's no way that the Dickens could have won.
I think the point about the gap between that somebody over there made, between the revolution and the final appearance of the bourgeoisie goes right to the heart of the question of the transition between feudalism and capitalism, and also the structural importance of the English Revolution. Because in a way, there's been for a long time this debate that there is always a rising middle class in the early modern time, but never rose properly. There's always the rising capitalism, but never actually turned up properly until the 19th century. And if one reads Marx carefully, of course, he sort of develops this that it needs to develop capitalism in order to have bourgeoisie, which of course then we get to the revolution and we see that we don't have a developed bourgeoisie in the revolution. So there's a contradiction in terms between bourgeois revolution and the bourgeoisie leading the revolution, which leads us to the necessity to develop a different concept of bourgeois revolution, not a jettison, but to develop a different concept as a political, ideological revolution, which created the political and institutional and socio-economic structures within which capitalism could develop then. And I think this also affects the question whether we ask, was the English Revolution successful or was it not successful? I think it's nonsense to divide it up like Christoph Hill has done in the revolution that succeeded and the revolution that failed. That is lacking a total concept of the bourgeois revolution, what it did and which part in the development from feudalism to capitalism played.
Okay.
I've been told to make this very brief. I've been also told quite recently, because I'm going to go back and study history after about 26 years, that modern historians, revisionists, are denying the existence even of the ranters. And I'm a bit worried because the comrades here keep talking about the levelers and the diggers. And when I did English history in the 60s, we used to look to the ranters. And could you say something about that? Because I've got this silly idea, maybe it is silly, that our current stems from them, because they're the real reds in the revolution. So can you tell the comrades about the ranters?
Last contributor, then the last time I need to come back.
I've never been told to keep it brief, but just on the last book, one comrade who spoke and talked about the
wrote the preface to the Critique of Political Economy, and in it produced a very summary account of his ideas. These ideas have been under attack from two sides. From one side, which isn't present on the platform, and therefore I don't intend to deal with it hardly at all, has been the attack from the side of mechanical materialism, which reduces human action in history just to a passive effect of material changes. And in my article I go at great length with that, but I don't intend to. The other side of the attack, which is well and truly present on the platform in terms of Colin Barker standing next to me, has been to say, actually, the relationship with base and superstructure is a mere metaphor we can get away with. The question of clash between the forces in relation to production is a minor question. We don't really need to talk about in terms of development history. Now, I really want to concentrate on Colin's position, because I believe that it encapsulates the real problem we have. I will deal briefly later with Alex, because I think he fudges between myself and Colin. And I will say hardly anything about Duncan, because I think essentially he's on my side. If you read Colin Barker's reply to my article on base and superstructure, really he says he doesn't like something like the first 25 pages of it, because he thinks there's two things wrong with it. First, he doesn't like the base superstructure distinction. Secondly, he's not happy about giving priority in the development of human history to development of forces of production. I'll try and deal with those two things. See, I think it's absolutely crucial for any understanding of the contradictory nature, of the contradictory way in which society develops, that you have to have an understanding difference between two things. The first is the way in which human interaction with nature and with other human beings is continually throwing up new what Marx calls new relations of production. New interrelations between human beings and new ways of seeing those interrelations. New concepts, new ways of seeing, new ways of talking, new ways of coping with the world. But the other thing you have is the way in which you have, in all societies you know of, a certain congealing of old ways of interrelating with each other and with nature into fixed patterns. Even when you talk about pre-class societies, you talk about the establishment of systems of magical beliefs, ways of seeing the world, structures of society and so forth, which to some extent prevent any further development of interaction of human beings with each other and with the society. Marx distinguishes these two things in terms of the base and what he calls the superstructure. For him, the revolutionary centre of Marx's thought is the understanding that at certain points in history, for further development of human potentiality, further development of human control over nature, and further development of human relations, the old superstructure has to be smashed. This, in order to move to a horticultural level of production, from a hunter-gatherer society, you have to have a fantastic transformation in society. Change the whole ways in which society is organised. The old superstructure has to be smashed. This becomes absolutely clear when you talk about class society. Because once you have class society, the old superstructure is defended, safeguarded, policed by a ruling class which has a whole existence depends on maintaining the old organisation of production. And therefore it resists new developments of technique. It resists new interrelationships between people. It resists any advance of the forces and relations of production between it and tries to suppress these. This is the contradiction Marx refers to, the contradiction between the base and the superstructure. The base is the onward development of society. The superstructure is the old congealed relations embodied in an old ruling class, an old state, an old ideology, and so forth. To take that out of Marxism, actually, what you're left with, and you're left not so much in the case of Colin, who's probably got carried to the logical conclusion, but you're left with what you find among, I hate to use this phrase, among certain post-Althusserians, neo-idealist views of history you get. Because what you're left with is a view of history which is true. There's a conflict between classes. At every stage in history between the exploiting class and the exploited class, but that conflict doesn't take place within any objective parameters. It doesn't take place according to any objective factors. It's a purely economic conflict which doesn't manifest itself politically. I haven't got time to go into it, but the man who encapsulates the view more than any other I've come across, a man called Simon Clarke, who's one of the English post-Althusserians, who's really, I would say, let's describe it as that, who actually, who's really, his view of society is a view of capitalism, everything under the capitalist relation to production, the state's relation to production, the army's relation to production, everything's relation to production, and the tension so crucial in Marx between the base and the superstructure disappears from the analysis. You can't understand how the old structure prevents the onward development of society. Becomes, for me, it's a view of history in which there's always class struggle, but the class struggle has no direction to it, there's no objective parameters on it, and so forth. And Colin refers to the endless conflict between classes. He attacks me on my view of the medieval period because I talk about the rise of the bourgeoisie and the important role that plays. He prefers merely to talk in terms of a struggle between the feudal landlord and the feudal peasant, without understanding. Unless you talk about other changes in society, you can't understand the way in which at some stage in history the struggle between the feudal landlord and the feudal peasant was surpassed by something else, which led to capitalism. This leads on to the second point, which Colin tried to throw out. This is, he wants to say that in Marx, there's no priority for the forces of production over the relations of production. There's no way in which the development of the forces of production, however slowly, however long it takes to materialise, opens up, creates a new relation of production, a new forms of organisation of society. Now for me, this is wrong. Why? Because the forces of production is human potentiality. What Marx actually argues, the centre of Marx's picture of history, is human potentiality. In order to realise that in the past, certain forms of society were necessary, these forms of society then become an obstacle to the further development of human potentiality. And Marx also argues, because human beings actually don't like slaving away, slogging off, never resting, never talking, never relaxing with each other, therefore there's a certain tendency in human beings to try all the time to develop new, more efficient, less tiresome, less tedious ways of producing, more happy, nice ways of living. And Marx actually argues that in any society there's a tendency to try and develop the force of production. Of course, the old relation to production prevent this form of production. There's always a tension between the two. But if you want to see societies which do develop, not all societies in history have developed. Marx doesn't argue this tension is always resolved. Many societies, the forces of production have not broken through. Many societies. Societies do emerge where they break through, because these societies are more efficient, more productive, are able to develop more quickly and better than other societies. And actually, if you look at the rise of the crisis of the Middle Ages, resulting in the rise of bourgeoisie, you cannot understand it. That's throughout the Middle Ages, very slow speed, new means of controlling nature, new technologies, the use of the iron plough, the stirrup, the water mill, the new forms of navigation, the introduction of the compass, a whole series of technological innovation, fantastic important, taking place over 1,000 years, which meant the outcome of the crisis of human society after the 14th century was quite different to the outcome of the collapse of the Roman Empire 900 years before. Colin wants to wish all this way and just say there's just a continued struggle between the oppressed class and the oppressing class without understanding this key element in Marxism. Actually, the result of this sort of economism, which you talk about the class struggle taking place in always, but you don't talk about the key role of new changes, new developments, and the new emergence of new classes and class leaderships. Okay, sorry, I've got to skip page after page and deal briefly with Alex. Alex accepts most of what I say, but he wants to introduce one amendment. He wants to say, really, the relation of production only refer to relations of exploitation between classes. I think that amendment is fantastically dangerous. Why? Because in any society, you not only have changes from one class exploiting another, in that context of one class exploiting another, you have continually small changes, small developments in the force of production, which produce changes in the balance of class forces. Put it crudely, where we work, we 3 years ago, we introduced computers. The computers didn't introduce a change in relations of exploitation between us and the social world party of exploiters. They did, however, introduce various changes in the internal organisation of the office, which actually, if you want, are micro changes in relation to production, in relation to the people in the office, and in a certain sense, without changing the relation of exploitation, a change in the balance between ourselves and our employer.
Could you bring your comments to a close then, Chris?
I've got 1 minute, I'll finish. And I'll say, when you miss this, you have to say, why is the...
You haven't got 1 minute.
I will say that by removing that, Alex throws the baby out of the bathwater and ends up with a view of history which you merely have successive forms of exploitation. You don't understand what is the dynamic within each, which creates new relations, which leads to the overthrow. You fall back with the old Althusserian vision of different stages of society separated from each other without mechanism leading one to the other.
Comrades, I'm not going to directly answer what Chris has had to say. I want to take a bigger risk, and like Colin Barker meets the three bears, I want to argue the case for abandoning the language of base and superstructure entirely. Good. I want to argue that in 1857, Marx actually had an off day. And that problems which he was trying to deal with in 1857 in that preface, the language which he used, if you note, he didn't very much use elsewhere, and that he had a whole series of other ways of trying to grapple with the same problems that he's also trying to grapple with in the preface. That the reason that I don't like the language of base and superstructure is fundamentally that I think it has a number of bad effects. Because what time and again in the hands of Marxists attempts to do is to end up dividing, like Gaul, if you ever read Caesar, divides Gaul into three parts, it divides the world into three parts, the forces of production, the relations of production and the superstructure, or even worse, the base and the superstructure, and then we get comrades asking silly questions. It provokes silly questions, this rigidification. On the one hand, we'll have a comrade came to me and said, does the permanent arms economy belong to the base or the superstructure? Or as another comrade wrote in the journal, in the title of an article, is the family part of the superstructure? And I think that the very language provokes these kinds of silly questions. It also, if you read the preface, there is very little in the preface stress on something which is absolutely fundamental to Marxism, which is the whole stress on human production, productive activity, human creativity, on praxis, or practice, or whatever term you want to use. It's liable constantly to mechanical interpretation.
I don't want to accuse anybody on the platform of that, but I do think that it is a tendency in the language itself. And it also tends to suggest that politics and ideology and so on are secondary phenomena, somehow sequential on changes in something called the economic base. Now, the real question, of course, is what's the alternative and what's the problem that we are having to deal with? And I'm not going to be able to cover everything, but I'll rattle along as far as I can until I get stopped. You see, Marx's starting point is that bourgeois thought is wrong. And when we say bourgeois thought, it is not simply something which bourgeois writers write in bourgeois books. It's also what we meet when we have an argument with somebody in a pub. There are lots of bourgeois thinkers out there, comrades. And essentially, the starting point of the argument is that whenever you meet a bourgeois thinker, the bourgeois thinker says to you, there is something called society which has got laws. And those laws make any change impossible. And Marx's starting point is to say, rubbish. There is not a single thing called society. Society itself has many forms, and what we have to start with is the forms that society takes. And each of the different forms of society has its own patterns of organisation, and indeed, and Chris is absolutely right about this, of course, has its own laws of motion and own laws of development, which in each case bring it to crisis and internal contradiction and conflict. But each of those is different, and so on. And if you talk about something called society, immediately you start getting into problems. You always have to talk about forms of society, or as Marx called them, modes of production. Now, this is politically crucial, of course, this argument, because we meet somebody who says socialism is impossible because of human nature. And what they're doing is taking something which is a feature of this society, how human nature appears to us in this society as if it is an eternal feature of society. As Marx points out, the bourgeois economists time and again use categories like capital and try to spread them right back to primitive society, totally inappropriately. They make, in a sense, theoretically, they make a change in society seem impossible. Now the argument, therefore, is a fundamental political argument. It is possible, and indeed it is necessary, to fundamentally change the form of existing society, from one form to another form, in which all sorts of other language and all sorts of other categories will be necessary. Now, in order to explain a society, well, you say there are forms in society, you have to decide, and this is where the argument about base and superstructure comes, in part, though this is, of course, not all of it. You have to decide what are the fundamental principles around which this particular kind of society, this particular mode of production is organised. What is, to use a whole range of terms that Marx uses in different ways, what is its essence, what is its heart, what are its principles, if you like, what is its basis, etc., etc. And Marx, of course, had a specific proposal about this, which he put in the third volume of Capital, which he said, if you want the key, another metaphor, to unlock the innermost secret of any form of class society, he said what you have to look for is the way in which surplus labour is pumped out of the immediate producers, the direct producers. That, he says, is the starting point for understanding capitalism, for understanding feudalism, for understanding antiquity, or whatever. The key to it is the way in which surplus labour is pumped out. And I have to say, very briefly, that you can't that isn't all, because in each case you have actually to go on and see what else that implies, because you can't understand feudalism. For example, if you simply say, how is it pumped out, you don't see that that necessarily implies that the laws have got on their behalf forms of coercion, that the state, therefore, is part of that essential definition of what is at the heart of the mode of production, and so on. Similarly, that competition is necessarily part of the definition of capitalism, as is the capitalist's power to control his own property, and therefore, in some sense, the state is part of that core, that essence, that heart, if you want to use that language still, that basis. Now, of course, there's a problem with this, and that is, of course, that you can't grasp the complexity of any given society simply by saying that's all there is to it, because it isn't. And let me take an example. There was a discussion the other night about child abuse. And there was a comrade who stood up in the discussion, and I won't name him, in fact I don't know his name, and he said fairly early on in the discussion, child abuse is produced by capitalism. And because everybody behaved very well at Marxism this year, nobody actually groaned out loud. But, of course, at one level you have to say, of course, the comrade is absolutely correct, but at another level you think, thank God the discussion went on to demonstrate there is a great deal more complexity to this problem than simply saying capitalism produces child abuse. Because it is all the intervening arguments and all the complexities which actually make that basic proposition feasible. And a proper account of the question has to take account of all the intervening levels in the argument. Now, base and superstructure says always tends to propose there's just base and there's just superstructure. The same with the question of women's oppression, etc., etc., etc. There are a whole series, to use the language of Marx, of mediations between one and the other. And I think we need to have a framework in which we think, which recognizes not just two levels of an argument, but a whole series, and that will affect the way in which we talk about history, and I haven't said anything about history at all. But nonetheless, we will have to have a sense of that complexity. And it seems to me that time and again, the language of base and superstructure pulls us away from a proper recognition of that complexity, and I would rather that we looked around in all the rest of Marx, and the rest of Marxist thinking since, for better language and better ways of expressing these problems. We have to, Marx was very clear about it in relation to Ricardo. Ricardo tried to reduce, and this is the problem of reductionism, trying to reduce prices simply to values. And he said, therefore, Ricardo failed to explain a whole series of things. You have to go through a whole set of steps in the argument to go from the core value relations, the production of surplus value, to arrive at prices. In fact, if you were to apply the language of base and superstructure to the structure of Marxist capital, you have to say prices are part of the superstructure. Which would confuse a lot of comrades who think economics is about prices, and surely that's part of the base, and so on. In other words, you get into terrible confusions into this sort of thing. Anyway, I will stop because my time is running out by announcing that 2 years ago, two comrades who I won't name so as not to embarrass them, and I formed the Society of the Materialist Enemies of the Base and the Superstructure. It's called SMEBS, and you can join at the end.
Okay, well, my task is a fairly straightforward one, because all I'm going to do is simply to defend the position that Marx took in the 1859 preface and in Capital. That means that I'm going to agree with the main thrust of Chris's article and disagree with him only insofar as he disagrees with Marx. Now, what does that mean? What that means in the first place, that I agree with Chris that the distinction between base and superstructure is an absolutely fundamental one for Marxists. It means that I think he's right to say that the base consists in the forces and relations of production, and I think he's right to say that in the dynamic interaction between the forces and relations of production, that is the moving force in history, it is the development of the productive forces that is the more important of the two factors. So in all those respects, I agree with Chris, and therefore necessarily I agree quite strongly with Colin. I mean, I think a lot of what he said was quite simply tripe just now. I mean, about prices being in the superstructure is just bizarre. And I think it's important for Marxists to insist that there is a necessary analytical distinction, in other words, a necessary distinction that we have to make in order to understand the development and change in history between the base and the superstructure. The base, in identifying the base, the forces and relations of production, we are identifying what Marx calls the real foundation on which all other historical processes develop. Now, I also agree with Chris that this insistence upon the explanatory primacy of the forces and relations of production, they're the starting point in understanding society, is in no respect inconsistent with, indeed it requires a stress on human activity, on consciousness, on organisation and so on in making history. I think that what Colin said about laws of history being a bad thing is quite wrong. The concepts such as those of laws of history, what do they allow us to do? They allow us to identify the objective processes which define the scope within which human beings act to transform the societies in which they live. The problem with Chris's position is that some of the formulations he uses actually open the door to the kind of, I was going to say rampant idealism, but I think that's putting it a little strongly, that Colin's position really represents. In other words, that in particular, the way in which Chris understands the relations of production, one half of the base, threatens to undermine his general argument. Now, what's the problem? The problem is essentially that Chris conceives of the relations of production as playing a passive role in the interaction between the forces and relations of production. So, he says, the distinction between base and superstructure is a distinction between social relations that are subject to immediate changes with changes in the productive forces, and those which are relatively static and resistant to change. So that the relations of production are those social relations which are subject to immediate changes with changes in the productive forces, whereas the superstructure consists in those social relations which are relatively static and resistant to change. So that the idea is that as the forces of production develop, as human productivity grows on the basis of technical innovations and so on, the relations of production themselves change, and according to Chris, they change immediately. Now, that, I think, you can say that conception is right or wrong. What it certainly isn't is consistent with what Marx himself says. Because for Marx, the central role that the notion of the relations of production plays in his conception of history is that it is the relations of production that, depending upon the particular phase in a mode of production, further or fetter the development of the productive forces. In the early phase of a given mode of production, the relations of production stimulate the development of the productive forces. In its later phase, they hold them back. But listen, for example, to Chris. The old relations of production act as fetters, impeding the growth of new productive forces. That sounds all right. Then he says, how? Because of the activity of the superstructure in trying to stop new forms of production and exploitation that challenge the monopoly of wealth and power of the old ruling class. So that the idea is it's the superstructure, what Chris called in his introduction, congealed social relations, not the relations of production, which hold back the development of the productive forces. If you like, for Chris, the fundamental contradiction that historical materialism is about is the contradiction between the productive forces and the superstructure, not between the forces and relations of production. Now, I think the source of the problem lies in the fact that Chris is a very broad and vague conception of what the relations of the production are. In particular, he sees them as any form of social interaction, any social relationship involved in production. The trouble with that is that Marx himself sees some social relations as part of the productive forces. So that in Capital Volume 1, he talks about the labour process, which is essentially the kind of forms of social cooperation that a particular set of productive forces involve. So that for Marx, the kind of changes in the forms of social cooperation, if you can call them anything as developed as that occur in the offices of socialist workers, that change with the introduction of new technology, would be a change in the labour process. But for Marx, the labour process is part of the productive forces. It's not part of the relations of production. Marx's own conception of the relations of production is narrower. It's focused on two things. It's focused on the one hand, the relations of effective control over the means of production and over labour power. The relations of effective control by the ruling class, the exploiting class, over the means of production, and arising on the basis of those relations of control, a particular form of exploitation. So let me just read the key quotation from Capital Volume 3, which Colin slightly misrepresented. The specific economic form in which unpaid surplus labour is pumped out of the direct producers determines the relationship between rulers and ruled. It is always the direct relationship of the owners of the conditions of production to the direct producers. Listen, Colin, a relationship always naturally corresponding to a definite stage in the development of the methods of labour, and thereby social productivity, which reveals the innermost secret of the social structure. So there we have the idea that relations of production consist in the way in which the exploiters control the means of production and the forms of exploitation that arise on it. So it's a very specific and definite conception of the relations of production in Marx. By contrast, I think Chris effectively dissolves the contradiction between the relations and the forces of production. Now, does any of this matter? It matters, I think, for two reasons. First of all, that the narrower conception, Marx's narrower conception of the relations of production, explains why the superstructure performs in part freezing activities. In other words, that the exploiters, on the basis of the interests and the powers that they have within the relations of production, then try to use the state ideology, create the state and ideology and so on, in order to try and preserve the existing set of relations of production. And equally, the exploited classes resist. Secondly, and this is the crucial point, conceiving the superstructure as necessarily conservative, necessarily playing a stabilising role, which is how Chris does conceive of it in his general definition of these key concepts, is inconsistent with his absolutely correct stress on the role of consciousness and activity in his historical materialism. In other words, by the conceiving the superstructure as necessarily a conservative force, he opens the door to the kind of argument that Colin puts forward, which is really to say that all these sharp, hard, clear definitions that Marx goes in for, like the distinction between base and superstructure, are inconsistent with human activity and the stress on the class struggle in history. If we compare Marx again, we see that Marx doesn't see the superstructure as simply a conservative, stabilising force, freezing existing relations of production. He talks, for example, about the legal, political, religious, aesthetic, or philosophic, in short, ideological forms, in which men become conscious of the conflict between the forces and relations of production and fight it out. So that it's not simply, the superstructure isn't simply a matter of ruling class domination, it's also where the conflict between the forces and relations of production and the class struggle arising from it receives conscious expression and is fought out. The superstructure, in other words, because it rests upon the real foundation of the forces and relations of production, reflects the conflicts generated in the base, the economic crises, the class struggle and so on, so that and as it reflects it, it serves the struggles that go on arising on that basis, ideological, political and so on, destabilise as well as stabilise the existing society. The superstructure is contradictory because it reflects the contradictions of the base. So that the conclusion I draw, quite simply, is that I agree with Chris's general approach on base and superstructure, but some of the concepts he uses has the effect of undermining his overall argument. And that is unfortunate, and that does create the danger then that people who essentially want to reject the distinction for far, far worse reasons than Colin does. Colin wishes to do so simply further to develop and clarify Marxism, but people with very bad intentions who want to attack Marxism can then use the problems in Chris's formulations to reject Marxism directly.
Right, comrades, well, perhaps three's enough, and I hope I don't make confusion worse confounded. I want to make 3 points, 3.5 really. This is the hard one. I do not accept Chris's formulation of the contradiction inherent in Marxism and so on and so forth, for reasons which I have written about elsewhere, and people who are interested can read it. I will merely say that on the general question of method, in the reality, the apparent contradiction between determinism and voluntarism, will, and so on, is not a matter of some formula which you can construct a version of it. It is in the reality. In short, I've gone on too long about this already. The old adage about TV, do not adjust your set, the fault is in reality. And I think that Chris's initial discussion of this question is marred by the fact he doesn't wholly accept that. However, maybe it's a polemical point. Now we come to the second point, which is important. Colin is wrong, simply wrong, about what he says Marx thought about relations of production and forces of production. Now, of course, I don't suggest that there's any question perhaps Marx was wrong. Let us be quite clear what Marx understood by them and what most of us always thought was the correct thing. You see, the forces of production include at least 2 things. On the one hand, the level of material technique, which of course includes the necessary knowledge and so on. On the other hand, the actual producers, the producing class or the producing classes. That's the forces of production. And it's the moment we stick to that, quite narrowly, no confusion can arise. Relations of production are entirely different. They are relations between social classes, determined, of course, by the productive forces, but they are relations between classes. I'm not happy with Chris's, social transformations in socialist worker analogy either, because, come on, definitions, any definition, actually, if pushed too far, leads to scholasticism. Let's look at the thing from the point of view of actually utility. The truth of the matter is, so long as we stick to relations of production as being essentially class relations, structured by the productive process, which in turn depends on technique and the workforce, yes, fine. Now, Colin is specifically wrong when he says, I'm referring to his article in this issue 34 of Socialist Review, he's specifically wrong when he says, for Marx, it is clear some social relations are themselves forces of production. Now, this isn't elementary confusion. He goes on to say, one example is human productive cooperation, which is simultaneously a productive force and a form of social relations. Now, comrades, this is a confusion of concepts. Of course, it is true that the same thing, looked at from different points of view, appears in different aspects, but the distinction is absolutely clear. Colin confuses it. Chris is right on the material question here, which is that changes in technique, changes in actual technique, and therefore the corresponding changes in the labour process are the primary things making real social change possible. If you abandon that, you abandon not just some formulation of Marx, you abandon a scientific materialist approach altogether. That is fundamental. Of course, Colin is right in what he said later on in the article, but actually, all sorts of things are possible. It is true that various outcomes are possible in some situations. The class struggle determines. But it is the actual question of the level of technique and changes in the level of technique which determine, if you like, the limits of the possibility. Specifically, I think Colin is quite wrong to argue, actually, perhaps he doesn't argue, perhaps I have misread it, but that's how it came across to me, that struggle, peasants, landlords, and so on and so forth can produce permanent social change. It cannot, unless there has been prior and continuing technological change. It can produce class struggle, yes. It can produce an overturn in a political sense. It can change the personnel of the rulers. It can even change the political cause, but it cannot change anything fundamentally. Right? Fundamental social change depends on technological change. No question about it. I'm not arguing. I'm not arguing that technological change is autonomous or anything like that. So we now come to the problem. Oh no, I must say something about the Maya or Maya, whatever you call it, civilization example that Colin used. You know, it has one thing about it. Nobody knows very much about it. You can write in any damned hypothesis you like and it can't be disproved. Now we come to Chris. And here, I don't want to make confusion worse confounded, but actually, as against both Chris and against Alex, to me it is quite clear that base and superstructure distinction is an analogy and no more than an analogy. It is an analogy which in many cases, perhaps in 90% of the cases, is a very useful one. But at the end of the day, I agree with Callinicos on this question and the whole practice question. How many minutes have I got? Have I got time to quote you? Yes, I have to.
You've still got 5 minutes.
Or whether I've got time or not. You know? A socio-historical factor of any kind is an abstraction. That is to say, it exists in our heads. Of course, it corresponds to something real, but essentially it is a concept in our heads.
The idea of it originates as a process of abstraction. In order to understand reality, we have to ignore a large number of things. To look at the wood, we have to ignore the peculiarities of the trees, if you like. That's what is meant by a process of abstraction. Yeah? Thanks to the process of abstraction, various sides of the social complex assume the form of separate categories based on superstructure. One of them, and the various manifestations of the activities of social man are converted in our minds into separate forces which appear to give rise to and determine this activity. I absolutely agree with that. The whole notion of the social complex, we, in order to grasp a complicated reality, have to make abstractions. Whether those abstractions are valid or not is determined at the end of the day by their utility and by nothing else. Now, Chris takes all this analogy altogether too serious. Altogether too serious. The base of the superstructure, of course, includes development. I do agree with Alex on this. It includes the ideological element, ideological superstructure, as well as the theory, the bodies of people who are abstracted from the productive process, all the rest of it. Yep, he takes it too seriously. I'll try and show very briefly why this is so. Chris's model, in his article, actually fits a very large number of situations. It's the situation in which cumulative technological change, a bit here, a bit there, actually alters the productive process, modifies the relations of production, yes, and eventually, of course, against the resistance of a rigid or semi-rigid superstructure, we come back to Marxist formulations and we overthrow it. It will fit most cases, but it won't fit most cases. Come on, comrades. If we take the superstructure in its narrow sense, the sense of the personnel, it is simply not true that the complex gradual change from below, everything fundamentally from below, and then the superstructure is essentially conservative, and then eventually it gets overthrown. Won't do, come on. Look at the 20th century. Then the 15th, they get tired. What about the first 5-year plan? Total transformation of Russian society. Of course, rooted in the previous class struggle and the continuing one, yes, but where was the motive? Where was the motive force? It was from the superstructure, it was from the state. Now, that is shocking to mechanical Marxists who learn the formula, yes, base, change, actually quite a reality, and it is not. Late 19th century, bourgeois revolution in Japan had significant elements of the same thing. On that, let us look at our own historical record. A major change, and actually an important stage in the transformation of feudal property relations into bourgeois models, the Reformation in this country, was not actually carried out as a result of an upheaval from below, not even as in Germany and in Scotland, as a result of what we might call a factional struggle between different elements of the old feudal class. On the contrary, it was carried out by the state for its own reasons, by the superstructure, Henry VIII, Renaissance prince who didn't need to learn from Machiavelli. The truth of the matter is that having acute financial and other problems, the point is, more than a third of all the landed property in the country, and landed property at that time, you can say, very, very roughly equals property in the Marxist sense, changed hands in a decade. A whole new layer of bourgeois, and so on, oriented on commodity production without any of the inhibitions of the old quasi-feudal church-landed structure and sort of way. It's not true that that was as a result of things in Chris's model. Chris's model is fine as a general proposition. It is too rigid and therefore makes himself vulnerable to criticism, someone such as Colin has made, and others. And it's too rigid, basically. At the end of the day, comrades, come on, Platonov is right. The abstractions exist in our head. They do correspond to a reality, yes.
Could you start now?
A changing reality, I am finishing, a changing reality, which actually can change in a whole series of different ways, depending on the course of the struggle. Not true that the superstructure is always simply rigid and resistant. Not true, the source of change is always from below.
If anyone who wants to speak, kindly put their hands up and I'll call you forward. Could you come to the front? After I've seen you, I'll indicate you should come forward.
Okay. Yeah, right, yeah. I told Chris Nolan I wasn't going to speak and he said, will I be able to resist it? And he was right, you know. But that's the only thing he was right on, in my opinion. Well, almost the only thing, apart from knocking Colin Barker, but I won't bother with that, everybody else did that so effectively. Duncan made me speak, because Duncan hit on what I think Duncan was so right about the state and the state's role in terms of the 5-year plans, in terms of the Reformation and so forth. And yet I want to take Duncan's point and reformulate it in such a way that I end up agreeing with Alex. Or that I made Duncan agree with Alex, in other words. That's going to be difficult, because Duncan just won't want to agree with Alex. That's where I think we've got to be. Why? Because I think actually we have to understand that what was involved, for example, at the time of the Reformation, was the state changing as part of a massive change in the relations of production. And the problem with our conception of the state is that we actually have to see it as an institution which belongs both in the base and in the superstructure, in the sense that the state is, on the one hand, involved in the relations of production, and at the same time, however, involves the law, political struggles and whatever, which also belong in the superstructure. In that sense, I want to take Duncan's point, but I want to end up agreeing with Alex, because I think the key points were made by Alex in terms of relations and forces of production. When Chris makes the relations of production a direct reflection of the forces of production, he gets us into all sorts of problems, and on that basis we cannot understand the history of capitalism. Okay.
I've never used one of these things before. I've got 3 minutes to tremble with it. I would like to say I agree precisely with what Colin Barker says, that to say that a certain phenomenon is simply caused by capitalism gets us nowhere. It's no explanation, and that we need richer analysis. I would like to ask him, where is this richer analysis that he calls for? And secondly, does this mean that an economic revolution is not sufficient to alter factors in society which he mentioned, such as the oppression of women, which are often simply said to stem from capitalism, but I would say this is no explanation whatsoever and gives us no real analysis for change.
Other speakers? Yes, come on. Could you please put your hand up if you want to speak, and I'll call you forward. I'm trying not to use 3 minutes and let somebody else in. I think, the problem with Colin's formulation is that, maybe the comrades will find this. Actually, the problem I have, is in convincing people that capitalism is the problem, and therefore the damn thing has to be smashed. In fact, it's in the interest of, actually probably the nearest person I've heard talk along the lines of what Colin said. Is some of the things I often hear from comments of people like Martin Shaw, trying to obscure the whole bloody thing, and actually, this category, that category, so on and so forth, the complexity, the rich totality, actually obscuring the fact that capitalism is responsible for child abuse. Capitalism is responsible for women's oppression. And actually, that is the argument that I think a lot of comrades have a problem actually dealing with. Unless we understand the notion of basic superstructure, and I'm sure, I don't understand everything that's gone on in the discussion, but I think, that is so important for us, and that Colin's notion actually is right up at that end. So, just briefly, I could agree with Alex. I think we've all heard the phrase that the forces of production will develop to a certain point where they come into conflict with the relations of production. The relations of production become a fetter which must be burst asunder in society to develop further. And considering that, and that we're all revolutionists, I'm surprised no one talks about October 1917, because it seems to me that what happened in the Russian Revolution was not that the relations of production were suddenly overturned by developments in the forces of production. Nor was it the case that that the superstructure would become a drag on the forces of production, and that was processed under by the forces of production. The point was that the class struggle reached a certain height, and the workers took power. And precisely the problem they were faced with after the insurrection, the day after insurrection, was sorting out the relations of production. It's basically reorganising society along classless lines. And I think that unless we can say that the superstructure is not just simply conceived of a congealed mass of social relations which are a drag on the forces of production, then there's no way we can understand October 1917.
Yeah, I'm absolutely convinced that the base of the superstructure argument is right, but it seems to me the problem comes when we try and cram the social relations production in with the forces production, or the actual means of production themselves. And really, the thought that occurs in my mind is that the social relations production are not so much part of the base, but in fact the base of the superstructure.